In 1872, about a year after the fall of the Paris Commune, Friedrich Engels wrote a short essay that he called On Authority. This essay was aimed at dismantling the anarchist notion of authority, and it's gained a lot of flack from anarchists that put it up on a pedestal as like Engels' most important work on authority and the hierarchy and so on and so forth. But this really couldn't be further from the truth, because On Authority is a very short essay on which he spent incredibly little time on. But really, the bulk of the work here isn't to define what authority is, rather to convince the masses that dialectical materialism is the correct outlook to analyze the world around us, rather than individualist anarchism. So let's quickly dive into this text and then expand on it a bit. A number of socialists have lately launched a regular crusade against what they call the principle of authority. It suffices to tell them that this or that act is authoritarian for it to be condemned. This summary mode of procedure is being abused to such an extent that it has become necessary to look into the matter somewhat more closely. So here Engels just starts with some context. There's always been a substantial number of so-called anti-authoritarians, anarchists, and even so-called socialists, mainly democratic socialists or Western Marxists, who reject any unjust, in their own eyes, vanguard party or transitional state in a workers' movement. Engels thought it was worth investigating the matter, since it could be a problem later on with opportunism and reaction taking hold of the worker movement. And the first paragraph is still true nearly 150 years later, with a growing trend of the Western left being a strong denunciation of all previous socialist experiments as either authoritarian, totalitarian, straight up not socialist, not pure enough for their liking. The list goes on. They disregard any and all progress that these movements have made to improve the material conditions of millions of people, along with the challenge it posed to Western hegemony and imperialism. Now, this leftist ideology of Puritanism is incredibly revisionist and idealist. It fails to consider any and all material conditions, stages of history, foreign intervention, still existing class relations during the revolution that must be crushed, that bring the bourgeoisie to do everything possible to preserve their class interests. The necessity to build productive forces and centralize the means of production through a planned economy on our path to socialism. Remember that socialism is a stage of development that, like feudalism and capitalism, just like communism, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a transition state. Lenin talked about this kind of thinking in his 1917 work State and Revolution, citing Marx and Engels' 1873 controversy with the anarchists. To prevent the true meaning of his struggle against anarchism from being distorted, Marx expressly emphasized the revolutionary and transient form of the state which the proletariat needs. The proletariat needs the state only temporarily. We do not, after all, differ with the anarchists on the question of the abolition of the state as the aim. We must temporarily make use of the instruments, resources, and methods of state power against the exploiters, just as the temporary dictatorship of the oppressed class is necessary for the abolition of classes. Marx chooses the sharpest and clearest way of stating his case against the anarchists. After overthrowing the yoke of the capitalists, should the workers lay down their arms, or use them against the capitalists to crush their resistance? But what is the systematic use of arms by one class against another if not a transient form of state? This is from chapter 4 of State and Revolution. Now, this is pretty well put and explains the main issue that anarchists have with their own misconception of Marxism: the relation between the revolution and the state. If we're to crush the bourgeois state and achieve communism overnight, how does that happen? How do we ensure worker control of all factories and enterprises and coordinate their production without reproducing market relations? How do we crush the bourgeois resistance? How do we defend against Western imperialism, if we're talking about the imperial periphery? How do we prevent the national bourgeoisie from screwing up all the progress we made if we don't crush the bourgeois state apparatus and build a provisional, transitional worker state that uses this proletarian special body of armed men, that's not so special after all, it's just the workers, to organize armed resistance against this national bourgeoisie? Radio silence. As Lenin further expanded in this same work, and the dictatorship of the proletariat, i.e. the organization of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors, cannot result merely in an expansion of democracy, simultaneously with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the moneybags. The dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists. We must suppress them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Side note, here we can also mention slavery as a remnant of feudalism that still exists in capitalism today. Their resistance must be crushed by force. It is clear that there is no freedom and no democracy where there is suppression and where there is violence. Again, this is from Satan Rev, this time chapter 5. Back to the main text. Authority, in the sense in which the word is used here, means the imposition of the will of another upon ours. On the other hand, authority presupposes subordination. Anarchists use the concept of authority in the sense of a dreadful entity, something to avoid at all costs, which, against natural law, subordinates one group to another. Their definition of authority presupposes oppression, which is a subordination like capitalism, colonialism, and other rightfully denounced systems of oppression. They oppose the concept entirely, forgetting the idea itself of the vanguard party, in favor of immediate abolition of the state, without meeting any of the necessary conditions for the withering away of the state, illustrated by Marx and Lenin. Speaking of, have these people read Marx or Lenin? Have they understood their readings? Do they not realize that the substitution of the capitalist state for a state defined as the organized proletariat is precisely the anti-authoritarian tool they claim to be against? It is crushing the instruments of oppression by oppressing the oppressors. Master dialectician at work here. How do they expect the revolution to defend itself against the imperialists and the reactionaries? Unfortunately, that's what we've seen in Mexico. The revolution of the Zapatistas has held up within the past 30 years. I don't want to speak ill of them. I think it's a great revolutionary movement. Unfortunately, it seems that they've become like a moribund movement with people being disengaged because the struggle has lasted for so long without any step-ups in the class struggle, and with the Mexican government constantly repressing them. There has been no expansion of the struggle of crushing the bourgeois state and replacing it. To be perfectly clear, anarchism is individualistic in nature. Don't touch my homestead, leave everyone alone. Now, I don't really mean to denounce all anarchists as reactionaries and enemies of the workers' movements, like Stalin did in Anarchism or Socialism. I've had experience in popular movements with anarchists, yet it's precisely this philosophy that doesn't threaten the global capitalist order. Disorganized movements always end up getting crushed by the bourgeoisie. It's no surprise that the establishment has no issues promoting anarchism in its proponents like Noam Chomsky. Their bottom line isn't really challenged by it. So we often see anarchists doing like very direct action, aka sabotage, and I do encourage this kind of work, but the sentiment amongst MLs is usually of denouncing this as adventurism. I don't think everything should be denounced as adventurism. For example, bombing an Israeli weapons manufacturer is incredibly based. And for the purpose of respecting YouTube's terms of service, I don't directly endorse this. But as Marxist-Leninists, our goal is to build up a vanguard that will help the masses overthrow the capitalist order and establish a successful workers' movement and build socialism. All of this anarchism stuff is quite idealist. There needs to be at least some sense of hierarchy, usually in the form of councils. For example, take the Supreme Soviet of the USSR in the early Soviet Union. I'm not talking about the revisionist eras and post that. I know that there was degenerescence in this case, according to various factors that I won't get into. I sound like Hakim right now. So Lenin and the Bolsheviks decided collectively of the correct and reasonable positions to hold and actions to take collectively as a council, and the rest of the party and the rest of the councils followed in accordance with democratic centralism. This hierarchy doesn't entail oppression, rather coordination between local and national organs of worker democracy. And the Soviets at the beginning weren't really authoritarian, it just had someone pointing the movement in a given direction to prevent contradictory or harmful decisions from being made. And in the councils, we had Bolsheviks, so it was not a single person pointing that finger, rather the collective. And many reasons for this degenerescence later on was notably because of something called a world war that killed close to 100 million people across Europe, the incredible agricultural instability during dekulakization of the agriculture sector. So just a few points to think about. Back to Engels now. Now, since these two words sound bad and the relationship which they represent is disagreeable to the subordinated party, the question is to ascertain whether there is any way of dispensing with it, whether, given the conditions of present-day society, we could not create another social system in which this authority would be given no scope any longer and would consequently have to disappear. On examining the economic, industrial, and agricultural conditions which form the basis of present-day bourgeois society, we find that they tend more and more to replace isolated action by combined action of individuals. Side note, we're talking about the division of labor here. Modern industry, with its big factories and mills, where hundreds of workers supervise complicated machines driven by steam, has superseded the small workshops of the separate producers. The carriages and wagons of the highways have become substituted by railway trains, just as the small schooners and sailing feluccas have been by steamboats. Even agriculture falls increasingly under the dominion of the machine and of steam, which slowly but relentlessly put in the place of the small proprietors big capitalists, who, with the aid of hired workers, cultivate vast stretches of land. Everywhere combined action, the complication of processes dependent upon each other displaces independent action by individuals. But whoever mentions combined action speaks of organization. Now, is it possible to have organization without authority? Now, here Engels points out that it is quite hard to organize a party, an administrative system, or even a factory without any kind of authority or knowledge hierarchy. Someone who takes the lead and directs the masses towards this common good, towards the most rational decision, is needed. And in the case of a vanguard party, someone who has more knowledge about theory, who is more well-read and more principled. Now, in no way, shape, or form are people subordinate to this orator. They can voice their disagreements if they please, but once the council comes to a majority decision on an important matter, the principle of democratic centralism applies. It's simply a question of not letting anyone just cause a train wreck in an assembly or make the party succumb to revisionist tendencies. And I think all of this authority ought to be questioned. People have a right to know that this person is competent at doing their thing. And that's why everyone should be recalled from their positions of power whenever necessary. And I think the whole schlick with the steam machine is not to say a stretch, because there's kind of an element of truth to it that we'll get to later. But I think the main point here that ought to be brought to the anarchists is the matter of the state itself, of unjust hierarchies. And so I can see how anarchists would read this and think, man, this is some strawman type shit. Back to Engels. Supposing a social revolution dethroned the capitalists, who now exercise their authority over the production and circulation of wealth, supposing to adopt entirely the point of view of the anti-authoritarians, that the land and the instruments of labor had become the collective property of the workers who used them. Will authority have disappeared, or will it only have changed its form? Let us see. Let us take, by way of example, a cotton spinning mill. The cotton must pass through at least 6 successive operations before it is reduced to the state of thread. And these operations take place, for the most part, in different rooms. Furthermore, keeping the machines going requires an engineer to look after the steam engine, mechanics to make the current repairs, and many other laborers whose business it is to transfer the products from one room to another, and so forth. All these workers, men, women, and children, are obliged to begin and finish the work at the hours fixed by the authority of the steam, which cares nothing for individual autonomy. The workers must, therefore, first come to an understanding on the hours of work, and these hours, once they are fixed, must be observed by all without any exception. Thereafter, particular questions arise in each room and at every moment concerning the mode of production, distribution of material, which must be settled by decision of a delegate placed at the head of each branch of labor, or, if possible, by a majority vote. The will of the single individual will always have to subordinate itself which means that the questions are settled in an authoritarian way. The automatic machinery of the big factory is much more tyrannical than the small capitalists who employ workers have ever been, at least with regard to the hours of work one may write upon the portals of these factories. Lasciate ogni autonomia voi entrate. Before getting into the substance of the arguments, it's important to point out that this is precisely the point against anarchism, that the subordination of the will of the individual under the will of the collective is by their definition authoritarian, and they see it as bad because they are individualistic. That's not how we drive societal progress. So in this paragraph, Engels argues that the workers are subordinated to the authority of the steam machine and production process for use, just like they are subordinated for the capitalists. That's because in his time the production used steam machines, which needed constant supervision. The collective is thus subordinated to the socially necessary labor time used to produce a consumption good or service, or in the case of a socialist society, to the production of goods for use without any surplus. So, according to an anarchist definition of authority, production itself is authoritative. Now, the question of steam is much less relevant in our epoch, where machines are robotized and steam isn't used as much. It's also possible to just hire more people and supervise the machines for shorter periods of time. Like, at the risk of sounding like a reactionary, workers can't just expect to find a job just to not work at all. Every able person should be able to give to society what they can give, or at least part of it. And then with time, the socialist tenet of from each according to his ability to each according to his work becomes from each according to his ability to each according to his need. High-stage communism. Back to Engels. If man, by dint of his knowledge and inventive genius, had subdued the forces of nature, the latter avenged themselves upon him by subjecting him, insofar as he employs them, to a veritable despotism independent of all social organization. Wanting to abolish authority in large-scale industry is tantamount to wanting to abolish industry itself, to destroy the power loom to return to the spinning wheel. So in short, there needs to be leadership to ensure good assignment of productive resources. The labor day can still be shortened significantly in the abolition of production for profit, in the abolition of private property, but it still needs to be organized to meet certain quotas because people need to survive. All of these previous paragraphs might, at first glance, seem like a kind of strawman from Engels. It does have some truth to it. Anarchy in production would be the death of the latter. The authority in production is only the quotas needed to be met. Workers can be in greater number and work less hours, and they can arrange that democratically. Not everyone has the same ability to provide labor power, and this should definitely be respected. But I think Engels' broader point is that the organization can be done by a council, a Soviet, but it will itself be an authority on the individuals who voted for a different decision. But of course, the collective project, the well-being of millions of people, is definitely more important than the feelings of one individual. Back to Engels. Let us take another example, the railway. Here too, the cooperation of an infinite number of individuals is absolutely necessary, and this cooperation must be practiced during precisely fixed hours so that no accidents may happen. Here too, the first condition of the job is dominant will that settles all subordinate questions, whether this will is represented by a single delegate or a committee charged with the execution of the resolutions of the majority of persons interested. In either case, there is a very pronounced authority. Moreover, what would happen to the first train dispatched if the authority of the railway employees over the passengers were abolished? So let's deconstruct this argument in the sake of making it simpler. So tenet A is that the cooperation of an infinite number of individuals is necessary during fixed hours in order to prevent accidents. Tenet B is that this organization presupposes authority, a very pronounced one, to execute this organization. But where does he go with this? Back to Engels. But the necessity of authority, and of imperious authority at that, will nowhere be found more evidenced than on board a ship on the high seas. There, in times of danger, the lives of all depend on the instantaneous and absolute obedience of all to the will of one. And then we have C, there is a necessity for authority. So as he says, this is just like in ships on the high seas. People need to follow orders of someone or a council who has more experience in dire circumstances. One of those dire circumstances might be, I don't know, a violent revolution that seizes all private property, overthrows the capitalist class, and is under constant siege by the imperialist West. In this case, Engels was arguing for a knowledge hierarchy, some kind of like very targeted technocracy to ensure the most rational decision taking in some regards. Back to Engels. When I submitted arguments like these to the most rabid anti-authoritarians, the only answer they were able to give me was the following. Yes, that is true, but there, it is not the case of authority which we confer on our delegates, but of a commission entrusted. These gentlemen think that when they have changed the names of things, that they have changed the things themselves. This is how these profound thinkers mock the whole world. This is something I partly agree with. Anarchists lack acceptance of the need for a technocratic order in some circumstances, like in the USSR, where there was a need to rapidly industrialize a backward feudal country to build productive forces, and from the 1930s onwards, fight off the Nazi aggressors that were vehemently anti-communist and were trying to genocide your own people. The Bolsheviks went beyond necessary with war communism and had to roll out the NEP to build productive forces while appeasing the land-owning peasantry. But again, I'm not gonna do left-com puritanism. I was not there. They had very challenging material conditions, and they had to do with what they had. So I'm not gonna sit there on my armchair and pretend I know better than the Bolsheviks. So wanting collectivization at all costs without a transitional period is as bad as wanting to instantly abolish the political state. You overthrow capitalism, you install a worker state, socialism, and from there, you constantly struggle for the abolition of classes, money, and the state. And from there, you replace money with labor vouchers, you constantly struggle, and within 50, 100, several centuries maybe, we don't know what the future might hold. It's hard to predict phases of development of history and how long they were going to last. We had a regression from a lot of socialist aligned nations going back to the capitalist order after immense destabilization. And I think it would be idealist to just assume we're going to reach a certain stage of history at a certain point. Our goal as socialists is to promote this class struggle, not to invent some sort of unicorn utopia where everything's perfect. Back to Engels. We have thus seen that, on the one hand, a certain authority, no matter how delegated, and on the other hand, a certain subordination, are things which, independently of all social organizations, are imposed upon us together with the material conditions under which we produce and make products circulate. We have seen, besides, that the material conditions of production and circulation inevitably develop with large-scale industry and large-scale agriculture, and increasingly tend to enlarge the scope of this authority. Hence, it is absurd to speak of the principle of authority as being absolutely evil, and of the principle of autonomy as being absolutely good. Authority and autonomy are relative things whose spheres vary with the various phases of the development of society. Now, here Engels makes an interesting point. First of all, that the material conditions of the production process develop the necessity for a certain authority, knowledge. And it is therefore idiotic to assume that the principle of self-management and autonomy is in all circumstances inherently a good principle to follow. And then freedom from authority, of self-management, is something that varies, that it's relative. And it cannot be absolute. Just like freedom of speech, it should definitely be open to a certain extent, right? You should be able to say pretty much whatever you want, as long as you're not directly harming people and advocating for genocide, you know, or for ridiculous things like banning care for transgender people because your personal fucking, I don't know, Mormon values tell you that these people are Satan or something. Back to these points, therefore, self-management can be a good thing, and it absolutely is in a lot of times, but it needs directions, aka a council of workers who can give directions to the individuals. By the way, this council is constituted by these individuals that get the directions, right? Like, it's not like the councils, the local councils of the Supreme Soviet even, are isolated from the masses. They are constituted from educated members of these masses. And people choose to get involved in those councils if they want to. And these councils are in every factory, even communities or hobby groups or any group of interests, right? Back to Engels. If the autonomists confined themselves to saying that the social organization of the future will restrict authority solely to the limits within which the conditions of production render it inevitable, we could understand each other. But they are blind to all facts that make the thing necessary, and they passionately fight the world. Why do the anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, the state? All socialists are agreed that the political state, and with it political authority, will disappear as a result of the coming social revolution. That is, that public functions will lose their political character and will be transformed into the simple administrative functions of watching over the true interests of society. But the anti-authoritarians demand that the political state be abolished at one stroke, even before the social conditions that gave birth to it have been destroyed. They demand that the first act of the social revolution shall be the abolition of authority. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon. Authoritarian means, if such there be at all, and if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which its arms inspire in the reactionists. Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day if it had not made use of this authority of the armed people against the bourgeois? Should we not, on the contrary, reproach it for not having used it freely enough? So here, we have a reminder that socialists have all agreed that the political state is a bad thing and that it will disappear with the withering away of the state in favor of a sole administrative function. And again, this is something that Lenin really expanded upon in State and Rev. Under socialism, you have, well, this administrative function that is healthcare, the planning of the production process, economic calculation, the DMV, right? You need people to be competent enough to drive. Under socialism still, yeah. This is something that anarchists lack a comprehension of. They want a revolution which instantly abolishes the state before the social conditions that gave birth to the state have been destroyed. There thus needs to be a certain authority, acts of violent struggle from the dictatorship of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie to impose its will upon them and to ensure that the social conditions have been met for the state to then wither away in favor of those administrative functions that ensure the well-being of society as a whole. Back to Engels. Therefore, either one of two things. Either the anti-authoritarians don't know what they're talking about, in which case they are creating nothing but confusion, or they do know, and in that case they are betraying the movement of the proletariat. In either case, they serve the reaction. Now this last part I have mixed feelings about, but they're only feelings. It's true that as a group they do serve reaction, as individualists, as opposers of past socialist experiments, as opposers of a vanguard. But individually, I think we can have conversations and come to an arrangement with certain points and convince them of the eternal science of Marxism-Leninism. This is the second time I've done this in this video. I, again, feel like a dogmatist. But again, just like Trotskyists, under no circumstance should they be allowed as a vanguard without renouncing the reactionary tendencies they hold. To put it simply, Engels divides authority into three types. We have physical force, the authority of knowledge, and the authority of character. Physical force is the most primitive form of authority, right? Our ability to use violence to impose our will on someone else. Now, the authority of knowledge is based on the position of specialist knowledge or skills that are needed to perform specific tasks or advance a specific goal. Then the authority of character is simply based on the trust and respect that individuals have for a particular person. I don't think this one is the most legitimate because it can be simply due to charisma, but a good orator is still a good orator. Engels also argues that authority, as a principle, should be based on the principle of democratic control. He suggests that the people should have the right to elect their leaders and that leaders should be accountable to the people. This is what Mao expanded a lot on, the mass line. Everyone should be subject to criticism and to self-criticism, to make sure the party does not alienate itself from the people by becoming a bunch of intellectuals that spend all day gooning to Mao quotes about true revolutionaries only eating red peppers. Engels also contends that leaders should be subject to recall, that they can be removed from office if they fail to perform their duties. I mean, of course. The goal of socialism is the advancement of history beyond capitalism, the transfer of power into the hands of the masses. Now, having read and annotated this essay, I must now look at some critiques written by opponents of Marxism. Here's part of one of them written by user Falgoon on their essay's Goodreads page. A lot of the comment was a bunch of ad hominems and insults, and I just removed those parts to keep the substance of the arguments because there are some points that are important to address. However, his proof in reality is chock full of mistakes, most of them essential for the deduction of the conclusion. Some of them are as follows. Anarchists do not oppose the kind of authority displayed in the first example, a collective making a decision based on a fair and mutual democratic system, which is devoid of hierarchy, or a centralized power, is not the authority that anarchists despise. Bakunin, don't ask this guy what he thinks about Jewish people. The person in the forefront of the movement that Engels is addressing makes that abundantly clear in his writings. Secondly, anarchists do not oppose the kind of authority displayed in the third example. Anarchists made a clear distinction between delegating work to an authority of something and being held dominion by authority. A doctor is an authority in medicine. Their suggestions and general advice on illness are in most part to be trusted, and we delegate the treatment of our bodies to them in times of poor health. The Bolsheviks held the people they were supposed to represent under their undue and centralized authority. People of their ilk must be opposed. There's a clear difference between the two kinds, which seems to be lost on Engels. This seems to be a half-assed attempt at refuting the argument by ignoring the bigger picture. Again, the bigger picture. This applies not only to the labor process, railways, and ships in the high seas, but also to decision-making itself. Now, this person claims that the Bolsheviks held people under their undue and centralized rule, and this really couldn't be further from the truth. What the Bolsheviks did was centralize power in the hands of the vanguard party, seeing as the masses were mostly uneducated and lacked organizational skills. Right? Russia was a feudal, backward state. Most of the people were either peasants that didn't own any land, landowning peasants, petty bourgeois, or the Romanov family, right? There wasn't much industry, there wasn't that much of a working class. Yeah, there needed to be a way in which the interests of this working class and the parts of the peasantry that was revolutionary were strived for. Democratic centralism made sure reaction didn't infect the party. Like, do we really want to allow some nut job to just come over to the party and say, hey, let's reestablish capitalism without any vetting? I mean, of course, that person is going to be clowned during the party meeting, but that's another question. Lenin and the Bolsheviks understood that, making worker councils the basis of Soviet political organization. What needed to be done was subordinate the bourgeois and petty bourgeois counter-revolutionaries to the will of the people. This couldn't really be done without centralizing power in the hands of a transnational worker state to eliminate bourgeois interests, social conditions which were the basis of capitalist society, and that needed to be repressed by strong means to then achieve the high stage of communism, the final stage of historical development. There was still a foundational principle of organization, councils, that were worker democracy, and they worked well for a while until mass political disengagement from the population. But yeah, let's not have millions die in a world war. I'm sure that's gonna help. 3. The second example presupposes a conflict between the authority of the passengers and the authority of the workers. Furthermore, it lacks specificity in its claim and reason for need of a strong hand to put the workers in line. For his next argument, Engels accuses anarchists of arguing in terms of semantics to advance their cause. He equates delegates of the people to envoys of authority and proclaims that changing names does not alter the truth. But by definition, anarchist delegates differ from autonomous representatives who hold power. Delegates can be recalled at any moment, and in many traditions of anarchy are limited in their ability to make decisions without the voice of the majority on their side. Side note, this is just what members of the council are. They're delegates. Representatives, in most cases, can make decisions with impunity, with only the fear of re-election and greater authoritative bodies to hold them back. His next argument against anarchism comes in the form of the support of the transition state and also by reflection an attack on the anarchists' belief that there shouldn't be one. That is a core point of contention between Marxism-Leninism and anarchism, a difference in ideology which cannot be explained in a review which is already way too long. Finally, he says that a revolution is the most authoritarian thing there is, a part of the society forcing its authority on another, thus implying that the anti-authoritarian anarchists are not revolutionaries. Here Engels discards his own definition of authority, the one which requires authority to be defined from a dominant position to a subjugated position, and just uses it as a synonym for will. How is subjugated class fighting for its rights for self-determination a perfect demonstration of authority, whose only prerequisite for existence is an imposition of force? How is it related to the hierarchical authority that anarchists oppose? Engels ends the essay by denouncing anarchists, proclaiming that they are either confused or counter-revolutionaries, thus setting the stage for the actions of the Bolsheviks against the Makhnovists and the Russian anarchists. Wow. This is not a counter-argument, they're merely pointing a difference in ideology between MLs and NCOMs without substantiating and then just appealing to a flawed definition of authority. And like, right, there lies a core difference between anarchists and Marxist-Leninists, that anarchists don't understand the stages of development of society. But like, this doesn't really set the stage for any significant action against anarchists as an individual, something they don't understand. They're too individualist to realize that there's a collective. Rather an ideological struggle against anarchism. It serves the reaction, and I do definitely think that a lot of these ideas should not be listened to. They should be discarded. Now, ignoring the bourgeois among them, but the workers amongst them are still comrades and can give valuable input on a lot of issues. They do know how to organize. They just need to understand the need for a transition between the historical phases of society, and that the contradictions within capitalism are what are going to cause it to be superseded by socialism. If we are able to organize the masses, because, yeah, it's socialism or barbarism, I guess. So this guy's critique only assumes a smaller picture, building some arguments of Engels and forgetting that the bigger argument is that you need some leadership. You need leadership in labor and social organizations. He also points out a supposed difference between delegates and representatives, as if they're not literally the same thing. They can be recalled by the masses of workers. This is the whole principle of the Maoist mass line. It's like they don't understand that the workers in the councils, like the representative of the workers in the councils, aren't also workers themselves. Like, it's not an argument for totalitarianism. It's democratic centralism. You direct the majority, the masses, towards the common good, the advancement of the proletarian struggle, and in return, the masses constantly critique your leadership, right? It's a dialectic. So I don't think there's the need to strawman and to perform historical revisionism while trying to rebuke the principles of Marxism-Leninism. Now, about this supposed authoritarianism, historically the developed socialist republics we saw aroused from a Marxist-Leninist uninterrupted revolution, as the material conditions of the proletariat were too poor to spend a significant amount of time developing class consciousness. So there's a lot of education work that had to be done to spread class consciousness amongst the masses. So there couldn't really be like an horizontal anarchist revolution that would seize state power and crush it, especially when you're under a constant threat of destabilization by the US, or just have your own national bourgeoisie that are going to try and preserve their own interests, aka the other armies that were fighting off the Red Army during the October Revolution. In the case of the USSR, the Bolsheviks took on that role, leading a vanguard that followed through with a revolution. They then industrialized the country and achieved lower stage communism, socialism, after the stage of NEP. They started rolling out those 5-year plans and planning production, and they were genuinely striving for continued class struggle. However, we saw a bureaucracy that arose that was kind of alienated from society. These people were calculating economic outputs by hand, tens of thousands of them, and there was, not even near the end of the Soviet Union, possibility of calculating this by computers. Kantorovich proved this in the 1930s, but no one listened to him, and they decided to still plan by hand, even through the 1970s and the 1980s, just to end up doing market reforms. So, yeah, the revisionism and the being point of not continuing the continued class struggle led to the collapse of the USSR. Notably, there was also external factors that were very important, because they had to spend a significant amount of resources into nuclear research, into their military, to prevent Western imperialism from making them collapse instantly. So, despite these outcomes, is state socialism, aka the siege socialism that movements are forced into by foreign intervention and sanctions, inherently bad and wrongly authoritarian? And will another form of authority replace the proletarian state apparatus? To arrive at an answer, we follow the logic of how common ownership of the means of production works out in practice. Common ownership presupposes that the decision-making process is under the democratic control of society. In short, a process for the distribution of human needs at a local, regional, and global level on the basis of free access and production for use. But there's a few factors that needed to be understood. The first one is that educated decisions need to be made, as one of the reasons socialism is currently preferable to capitalism is that capitalism has reached its limit to how it can improve the material conditions, and it's destructing our environment. It is causing a looming ecological collapse, rifts in the Earth's natural processes. And so we need to have some kind of technocracy when it comes to the climate crisis, otherwise we're not going to do any organized action together. And none of that makes the system inherently authoritarian, it just makes it work in the first place. But there's so many factors to take into account, combined with the fact that there's a multi-trillion-dollar apparatus of Western media constantly bombarding us about how bad these socialist experiments are, and exaggerate very important factors in there. Right? We have CIA documents talking about how Stalin wasn't a dictator, and they only released them recently because it contradicted the Cold War propaganda that he was a ruthless dictator who committed unspeakable crimes. And while yes, he did make some very important praxis mistakes, the good ultimately outweigh the bad. Though I think it's always flawed to make bold claims about socialism doing something better than capitalism in theory, as what's important here is historical materialism. Capitalism has achieved what it could to build productive forces, and it's no longer viable for the masses, so it ought to be superseded by socialism, the next stage of development of society. Now, in conclusion to this, I hope this was enlightening or instructive. Even if you didn't learn anything, I hope it was, at the very least, a small refresher. I personally believe that councils should be the basis of political organization and should always be subject to criticism from the masses to keep a democratic order and prevent mistakes of the past, whatever they may be. Whatever they may be. So democratic centralism is the center of Marxism-leninism after all. The big bad boogeyman of authority, however, needs to exist in order to continue the permanent class struggle until the social conditions are met for the withering away of the political state. And it's foolish to vehemently oppose any authority like a teenager who flees his somewhat strict parents. Because a lot of the time those anti-authoritarians are petit bourgeois or bourgeois and they're scared of losing their privilege. And I happen to be part of that labor aristocracy that is privileged and benefits from Western imperialism. And I'm 100% willing to sacrifice some of these privileges to advance class struggle. And most notably to ensure that not only humanity, but the whole biosphere can survive through these next few years. So there might be a time in the future where the social conditions make it possible for a transition to this final stage of communism, free of authority. For the time being, we need to stay rational and materialist, because the national bourgeoisie, the US, and the Zionist entity of Israel will do everything in their power to make sure that the workers fail in meeting their ends. please get organized, read up on Marxist theory, and if you want to support this channel and the work I do, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the comments if you want to help me buy some more coffee beans for my crippling coffee addiction.